He ran the most popular sport on Earth for 17 years. He turned it into a multi-billion-dollar global machine. And then, in a single week in 2015, Swiss police arrested his own executives in a five-star hotel, and the man who built modern FIFA became the face of one of the largest corruption scandals in the history of sports. This is Sepp Blatter. Blatter didn't start as a football executive. He joined FIFA in 1975 as a technical director, a relatively minor administrative role, but he was ambitious and patient. By 1981, he'd worked his way up to General Secretary, FIFA's top administrative job, and spent the next 17 years building relationships with football federations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Regions Europe's football establishment had largely ignored. That patience paid off. In 1998, Blatter was elected FIFA president, beating a European favorite by winning the votes of exactly the smaller federations he'd spent 2 decades cultivating. He inherited an organization that was already changing. His predecessor, João Havelange, had spent the previous 2 decades turning FIFA from a small Zurich bureaucracy into a commercial power, striking the first major sponsorship deals with companies like Adidas and Coca-Cola. Blatter didn't invent FIFA's commercialization, but he was the one who scaled it up dramatically and the one who built the political machine that would keep him in power for nearly 2 decades on top of it. Once in charge, Blatter moved fast. He took the World Cup to Asia for the first time in 2002, co-hosted by Japan and South Korea, and to Africa for the first time in 2010 in South Africa, a decision he was, by most accounts, personally proud of, and one that's remembered as a genuine milestone for the sport. When the South African tournament opened, Blatter called it proof that Africa could host the world's biggest events just as well as anywhere else, and for a continent that had never been trusted with football's premier tournament before, that mattered, regardless of what else was happening behind the scenes at FIFA headquarters. Under Blatter, FIFA's revenue exploded, driven by television rights and sponsorship deals that turned the World Cup into one of the most valuable media events on the planet. He also expanded funding to smaller football federations worldwide, money that built academies, stadiums, and youth programs in countries that had never had FIFA's attention before. To a lot of the footballing world outside Europe, Blatter wasn't a villain. He was the man who finally gave them a seat at the table and the resources to build the sport at home. But here's the part that doesn't get said enough. That same generosity was also the mechanism. The same funding that built academies and stadiums also bought loyalty, vote by vote, federation by federation. Blatter didn't just win the support of the football world's smaller nations. He built a system where FIFA's money and FIFA's votes flowed through the exact same pipe. And whoever controlled that pipe controlled the presidency indefinitely. In May of 2015, Swiss police raided a hotel in Zurich, arresting several senior FIFA officials just days before a scheduled presidential election. The U.S. Department of Justice unsealed an indictment describing decades of bribery, wire fraud, and money laundering connected to World Cup hosting votes, broadcasting contracts, and marketing deals. More than a dozen football officials and sports marketing executives were charged, including longtime power players like Jack Warner, a former FIFA vice president who spent years fighting extradition, and Chuck Blazer, a top American FIFA executive who ultimately became a cooperating witness, admitting under oath to accepting bribes stretching back decades. What investigators alleged was a systemic culture of corruption, reaching across multiple continents, hiding in plain sight for years. Blatter himself was re-elected president just 2 days after the arrests, defiant, saying he couldn't police the private conduct of every official. It didn't last. Within days, facing collapsing support in his own sponsors, publicly distancing themselves from FIFA, he announced he would resign. Then it got more personal. FIFA's own ethics investigators found that Blatter had authorized a $2 million payment to Michel Platini, a former advisor and one of European football's most powerful figures, for work Platini had done nearly a decade earlier. A payment investigators said had no contract, no clear justification, and raised serious questions about whether it was a payoff. Blatter was suspended, then banned from all football activity for 8 years, later reduced to 6 on appeal. He was replaced by Gianni Infantino in early 2016. And here's the sentence that should stop you. The man who now says the 2022 World Cup should never have gone to Qatar is the same man who was FIFA's president on the day that vote happened. That's not hindsight. That's a confession. 17 years too late, from the one person who actually had the power to stop it and didn't. Now in his 90s, Blatter is still around, and strangely, still relevant. In 2026, during the World Cup hosted across the United States, Mexico, and Canada, Blatter re-emerged repeatedly as a public critic of his own successor, attacking Infantino's close relationship with the Trump administration, criticizing visa denials that blocked officials and players from entering the host countries, and blasting a proposal to sell a financial stake in the World Cup itself to outside investors, calling football something that belongs to fans, not to institutions or individuals. It's a strange position for Blatter to hold. The man once synonymous with FIFA corruption, now positioning himself as the guardian of football's integrity against the people who replaced him. So how do you weigh a legacy like this? Blatter globalized football in ways that mattered genuinely to hundreds of millions of fans outside Europe who'd never had a World Cup or FIFA funding or a voice in the sport's governance before him. And Blatter also built, cultivated, and personally benefited from a system of patronage and quiet payoffs that investigators on 2 continents concluded had corrupted the sport at its highest levels for years, possibly decades. Those 2 things aren't in tension. They're the same story. The same relationships that brought football to new parts of the world were the exact relationships that let Blatter buy the loyalty that kept him in power and let a culture of bribery flourish underneath him, whether or not he personally directed every payment. It's a pattern that shows up in plenty of institutions that sit outside real democratic accountability. International sports bodies, some multinational federations, organizations answerable mainly to their own members, rather than to the public they ultimately serve. Power concentrates, oversight thins out, and the people best positioned to notice the rot are often the ones benefiting from it. Sepp Blatter globalized the world's most popular sport. He's also the reason most casual fans, when they hear his name, think of nothing but scandal, builder, or the man who sold football to the highest bidder. Tell me what you think in the comments. New profile every week. Subscribe if you want to see who's next.